I'm from Appalachia, a coal miner's daughter. For hundreds of years, people settled here to find freedom. They persevered by relying on themselves and their family to survive.
Very nice.
But my home has changed. We've lost our self-reliance. Appalachia has been left to fail. I'm Emerald, a proud Appalachian, and I want to thrive, not just survive. So I'm going to Washington, D.C. and team up with famed economist Dr. Richard Rahn, and together we will find those people around the globe who are thriving against all odds.
Switzerland. Landlocked, small, no natural resources to really speak of, but yet successful. Improbably successful, if you will, and perhaps the most successful out of 200 countries in the world. Switzerland tops the rankings, and the Swiss rate their lives highly because of the overall human development in Switzerland, long life expectancy, and high incomes, which are all big drivers of life evaluation. While the report does not equate happiness with prosperity, there's no getting away from the fact that Switzerland is a rich nation, with an average GDP per capita of $58,000. Switzerland is also the closest nation to a direct democracy, where citizens who garner 50,000 signatures within 100 days of the publication of a new law can propose almost any constitutional amendment they wish. Switzerland is an incredibly scenic country, with beautiful lakes and mountains for all to enjoy. Add world-beating chocolate to the list, and it's no surprise that the Swiss are so pleased. It ranks number 1 on the Index of Human Happiness. It ranks number 4 on the Human Freedom Index, which embodies such concepts as rule of law, civil liberties, press and religious freedom, and freedom of movement. According to the World Health Organization, Switzerland is tied for number 2 in average life expectancy. Switzerland is also ranked number 4 in economic freedom, which includes such concepts as protection of property rights, ease of starting a business, freedom of contract, reasonable regulations, free trade, and having a sound currency. Switzerland has also consistently had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world. The result has been that Switzerland enjoys a far higher per capita nominal income and per capita income as measured on a purchasing power parity than its European neighbors and other non-petrol states. And basically all that means is that the Swiss have a far higher income per person on average, even in comparison to the United States. But 150 years ago, Switzerland was not the success it is today. It was a very poor country. Then with the Industrial Revolution came the watch and precision industries, among others. But what has allowed Switzerland to really capitalize on their industry and continue to succeed while other countries have not? That's what I was here to find out. Already I had visited the bustling city of Zurich to see Swiss innovation and technology.
The most important cultural aspect of Switzerland is innovation. We cannot survive without innovation. If we stop to innovate, we will immediately become a very poor country.
As well as to learn about Switzerland's novel apprenticeship program, which is a big contributor to the country's low unemployment rate. I made a stop in the capital city of Bern to learn about the ideology behind the Swiss political model.
These ideas were very much ingrained in the classical liberal Enlightenment and the ideas of economic freedom.
I climbed up to the majestic Matterhorn. Okay, not really. But I did go to the small village of Zermatt to see how Swiss governance works on a municipal level.
The system in Switzerland is that the community, they have lots of rights. So it starts always from the communities up to the government in Bern.
What I had discovered so far is that Switzerland is a bottom-up society, meaning that the power lies with individual citizens and works its way up the chain of government in what is called a direct democracy. The people have the power to veto laws they do not like. As a country with no significant natural resources, Switzerland places significant focus on the individual, as exemplified in their apprenticeship program in post-high school students who work in their particular field of study at a company while earning a wage. The Swiss know that their existence relies on innovation and that individuals must be given the freedom to innovate and create new technologies and startups. But I wasn't finished digging. I had one more stop on my journey in Switzerland to learn about the history of one of Switzerland's oldest industries and how the Protestant Reformation influenced their culture. I have seen here in Switzerland the importance of individual freedom that seems to be the real key to Switzerland's success. So back on the train I went. Next stop is Genève. Genève, a French-speaking city situated on the French border and the famous Lake Geneva. An international hotspot with a demographic of numerous nationalities, Geneva ranks high in quality of life indexes and is one of the most important financial centers in the world. And one of the reasons Geneva holds such an important place in world finance is thanks to its banking industry. Dr. Ron's longtime friend and banker, Christian Ron, no relation that we know of, explained how the finance industry and wealth management rose out of the textile industry in Switzerland. Christian's family owns the oldest bank in Zurich, Ron and Bodmer, which was founded over 250 years ago.
Most of the things start in the history. And let's go back to 1336 in Zurich. Textile started to become a big part of the industry in Zurich, probably because it was located at water transport systems like lakes and like rivers which flow from here to the sea. They were trading mostly silk at the beginning, later on and also cotton, but at the beginning mostly silk. It became very strong in silk trade in Switzerland.
Now, what year are we talking about?
Now we are talking about end of 1600, so 1600, 1700. And from then on, many silk trading houses were formed and have been operating very successfully. Many of those silk trading houses, like for instance my own bank, was also a silk trading house at the beginning. Many of those silk trading houses were transformed into banks because those silk trading houses did two things. First, they traded silk. And since our purchasers of the silk could not pay cash when they bought the silk, they paid later with a check or a letter exchange. And so they paid 3 months later, but they did not pay 100, they paid 103 because they did not pay right at the time, so they had to pay some interest. So they paid 103. And then the longer the more, those silk trading houses turned to be banks, either because those partners at the time had more interest in doing banking, or it was financially more interesting to do banking. And so banks like our banks moved from financing smaller things to actually money managing. So the banks and the finance industry only started to really grow after World War II. This was the time where Switzerland and Europe really rose out of the ashes of the Second World War. A middle class started to exist, and they also had interest in having their assets managed also from banks, and so all the money management banks then started to really grow. This was then from 1950 to about 1970s. Many of those banks started also to take on many more employees. So coming out of the Second World War being 15 or 20 people, then until the 70s, many of those banks moved to 150, 170, 200 people. But only EDP systems, computer systems, then really made it possible to develop the banks to an industry which we are used to now. For instance, our bank has now 200 employees. If we were to do the exact same business without help of the computer systems, we would need about 2,000 people. Wow. This could not be financed. So this industry would not exist the way it does exist. So only through the means of computer systems, really the whole finance industry took really off and started to become a major industry in Zurich and in Switzerland.
As incomes rose in Switzerland and the middle class developed after World War II, there was money available for housing and starting businesses. The growth of the private banking industry meant an influx of capital from the rest of the world. This money could then be used by entrepreneurs to start up businesses, like Nestle, for instance. The capital to start new businesses added to Switzerland's growth and success and meant more employment opportunities for its citizens. But the Swiss banking still seemed a little mysterious, like the stuff we see in Hollywood movies. So I met with the now retired head of the Swiss Private Bankers Association and Geneva native, a rare thing in this global town, Michel de Robert at the historic Tiffany Hotel.
Well, the fact that Geneva is quite different is perhaps also the fact that we'll have 42% foreigners, which is an enormous amount of foreigners.
42% of your population in Geneva is foreign-born?
Foreign-born, yeah, and about a third is Swiss-born, but not Genovese, and Geneva I'm in the real minority being in Geneva.
Although there are big corporate banks, more like we are used to in the US, such as Credit Suisse, Swiss banking is unique because of its smaller private banks, which are partnerships where the partners have unlimited liability, like Christian Ron described. At one time, the U.S. used to have many banks that were partnerships, but the system has continually become more corporate over time. However, Switzerland has managed to maintain many private banks. I asked him how the banking system worked in Switzerland.
Most private banks are really partnerships, unlimited partnerships with unlimited partners. They have personal liability. It has changed a little bit in the past years because the personal liability lies with a head company, and the bank itself is a corporation, but it's owned by partners. The advantage of having unlimited partners is that the clients know that the moral hazard is much smaller because the owners are the managers, basically. So the managers are not going to cheat the owners because they are the same people.
That's definitely an incentive to do things right. The modus operandi has served the industry well here in Switzerland.
Some of them have grown quite big, actually, many thousands of people, but a number of them are still quite small and doing very well, but it's a different business model, really.
Why is that? Why would the small banks be able to stay around so long and do well? What model is that?
Well, they have to keep it simple. But if you have a triangle, you have 3 lines to keep to join the dots. Imagine if you have 100 dots. It makes it much more complicated. And basically, if you keep it simple, you have less costs.
It sounds so simple and clear-cut. So I had to ask Michel, why does Swiss banking get such a bad rap as notoriously depicted in the movies?
Maybe they're too successful. You get hated by some and you're loved by the others because basically beauty is in the eye of the beholder, If you look back, you see that back in 1977, for instance, 1977, the Swiss banks know exactly who are their clients. That is, you have proper know your customer rules, and you can have any kind of structure. The banker has to know it. If he doesn't know, it's his fault. And this is the basis of money laundering rules, which is not always applied in every country. So, and it has been like that for 40 years. So, really, there is no, of course, you can have problems, but you can't hide, the banker cannot hide because he has to know his clients.
The private banks are a good representative of the Swiss idea of a bottom-up culture and individual responsibility, as Professor Gazella at ETH described. Most of these banks are run by partners of families who have full liability should anything go wrong, meaning everything they have themselves is at stake. In a way, it's as if they're putting their money where their mouth is, so people can feel safe about putting their money away with the Swiss bankers. And again, the ideas represented in the Swiss banking system find their origins in the Protestant Reformation. As I had mentioned back at the Fraumünster Cathedral in Zurich, here in Geneva I wanted to know more about the history of the Reformation, because it has so much to do with the ideas that have made Switzerland so successful.
He was a reformer, and he couldn't do what he wanted in France, so he came to Geneva. And the Geneva people were quite happy to become Protestant and to have less to do with the bishop, who was basically the boss of the town. He was not living in the town, but they thought it was a good way to get rid of the bishop forever in changing religion. So Geneva became a very important, they call it the Protestant Rome, which is a bit exaggerated, to be honest, but it started having important links with other countries which are also Protestants in the Netherlands, in Scotland, and after that, of course, in America. So Geneva has this international flavor, to say so. And then it became an important, but of course, other things followed. And this is, I would say, the difference between Geneva and Zurich as far as their financial centers are concerned, because the Geneva Financial Center was created out of these faraway links with America, with Scotland, whereas Zurich was much more domestic financial center, developed like Frankfurt or maybe Paris or wherever. And Geneva has this international flavor. And this is why probably it became such an important center for international wealth management. So it's all started with ideas, really, rather than with industry or finances.
And it was these ideas from the Protestant Reformation that greatly influenced the establishment of individual freedoms Swiss citizens enjoy today. We headed off to Bastion Park to meet up with Richard's longtime friends, Vicky and Jackie Curzon. Vicky was going to give me the historical tour of Old City Geneva while detailing more on how the Protestant Reformation was an important influence on the Swiss way of governance and business. Vicky is an economist, a former and first woman president of the prestigious Mount Pelerin Society, and a retired professor at the University of Geneva. Her daughter Jackie is a great example of Swiss entrepreneurship. Jackie runs her own company to help startups as well as established businesses.
So people come here for different reasons. I'd say maybe 20 years ago, the main driving force was taxation, tax reasons. But we see less and less of that happening now, and it's we had the very large multinational companies, of which I unfortunately did not advise, but people like Procter & Gamble and Caterpillar, just the very large American multinationals who came here. That was 20 years ago, and that was mainly tax-driven.
Jackie's company actually helps other companies to start up. These startups are a major source of employment in Switzerland. In fact, Switzerland has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the entire world.
How easy was it to start up here?
It was very easy, very easy. I was in a fortunate situation because I already had a stream of clients. And then it just grew. It was also very good years. We started in 2000, and they the whole 2000, 2010 were excellent, very, very good years for Geneva economy. A lot of people were coming.
Why was that?
Maybe you should ask my mum, the economics professor.
Yeah.
Oh, well, one of the things was that I would cite two things. One, Switzerland had just passed a law limiting federal expenditure and obliging the federal government to balance its books. And secondly, Switzerland negotiated a bilateral agreement with the European Union whereby it opened its labor market.
Because we are a federal republic in the U.S., the steps to starting a business vary widely state by state, but it's generally very easy as it is in Switzerland. However, it's much harder in neighboring Germany and Italy, both of which have much higher rates of unemployment.
Well, I know that Switzerland has always been a forerunner in rights and freedom and liberty dating back hundreds of years. And Richard said she has some things you could show me regarding Switzerland's history.
Yes, let's go to the Reformation Monument and I'll show you the first Bill of Rights.
Oh, I love that. Are you guys going to be okay?
Okay, thank you.
Enjoy the park.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Emerald, I wanted to show you this Reformation Monument because this is where you can see how Geneva in particular, but Switzerland also, became Protestant. And that's important from an economic point of view because the Protestants deny the divine right of kings to rule. And that means that the kings can't grab money as they always used to, completely denying property rights. And here you have one of the first Bill of Rights, which says that the levying of money without the consent of Parliament is illegal. And that dates from 1689. It's a long time ago, well before the American Revolution, which also contains the same rights, property rights.
Is that where we got it for our American?
Well, it's yes, of course. We get all these ideas come out of the Enlightenment, which puts individual rights before society and before the divine right of kings to rule.
And then we headed up to the Old City to see the historical Calvinist church and other sites. I felt like I was stepping back hundreds of years in time as we wound our way through the ancient maze of small streets. Though the picturesque squares and cobblestone alleys are now lined with cafes, the historical significance of the old town is profound. It's home to St. Peter's Cathedral, once the site of an ancient Roman temple. It was at this cathedral that John Calvin preached Protestantism in the 16th century.
But I just thought you'd be interested in looking at this.
Oh, yeah.
You see? Auditorium, John Knox Chapel, you see? Service every Sunday.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's in English.
I love it.
Yeah, not it's because John Knox and Scottish, and there's still a sort of the link remains with the
Right. And my home.
yeah, and so that's Auditoire de Calvin.
After the tour, we enjoyed a cup of coffee in the Bastion Park restaurant, and Vicky told me more about the importance of the Reformation and talked about the history of the sites we saw in the old town.
Isn't this lovely? I'm so glad to have a cup of coffee. That's just great. Yeah.
I found it particularly interesting as my history is also tied to the Reformation. After being driven out of Scotland by the English, my Scottish ancestors made their way to the Appalachians in America during the Enlightenment, seeking freedom.
So it's interesting to see that my heritage in some way tied to that of Switzerland.
Well, indeed.
Origins.
And if you think that John Knox and Calvin, more or less contemporaries, and they're, Scotland and Geneva are way miles apart, but the speed at which the ideas flew across the whole of Europe, and in fact, sent the whole continent into the wars of religion, as we know.
And again, it was these ideas generated by the Reformation that man is master of his own destiny and should have the free will to choose, and the belief that a man's property is his own, not to be owned by the government, that created the foundation for a society that allows Swiss citizens to be so successful so many centuries later. In fact, it is impossible to understand modern history apart from the Reformation. We cannot understand the history of Europe, England, or America without studying the Reformation. The Reformation has profoundly affected the modern view of politics and law. Prior to the Reformation, the Church governed politics. She controlled emperors and kings and governed the laws of lands. The Reformation laid down once and for all the right and obligation of the individual conscience, and the right to follow the dictates of that individual conscience. Many men who talk lightly and glibly about liberty neither know nor realize that they owe their liberty to this event. Dr. Ron joined us just as Vicky was summing up what Switzerland has today as a result of its history and what contributes to its success.
Well, Switzerland has practiced free trade for a very long time, almost, I'd say, 2 centuries of free trade. That's already enormous. When you're practicing free trade, you can't really subsidize industries. It costs too much. The other thing, Switzerland is divided into 26 little sovereignties, the cantonal system. So you have a lot of regulatory competition between the 26 cantons. And that helps a lot because they're all fighting each other to attract business to their particular area. So that the levels of corporate tax are relatively low, sometimes go to zero. And
I like that.
yeah, well, so do many businesses. Now, unfortunately, Switzerland's neighbors, the EU and the United States of America, are saying that Switzerland is unfair tax competition, and they're forcing us to raise our corporate tax level.
This is so absurd because, you know, good economists say that corporate tax is one of the worst taxes and it ought to be zero.
That's
just
right.
for economic growth.
Because, as you rightly say, it doesn't make sense to tax what is the source of wealth. You can tax at any other point in the system, but don't tax the veritable source of wealth, which is the business entity. The Swiss themselves have never overspent. That is to say, their government has been sensible. The Swiss themselves are pretty sensible. So as we know in the macroeconomic terms, the country does not run a deficit, doesn't run a current account deficit. In fact, it tends to oversupply capital to the rest of the world. So the central bank has never had to worry about how to finance anything. If property rights are reasonably respected, then the economy will flourish. And if you don't respect property rights, then the economy collapses. And it's as simple as that.
And we see every place around the world, and it doesn't matter skin color or race or climate or anything else. Good policies work every place on the planet, and bad policies can destroy any place.
But fortunately, Switzerland has mostly benefited from good policies. Take, for instance, the Economic Freedom of the World Index. The judging criteria for this index includes several of the principles born out of the Reformation. First of all, rule of law, property rights, tax rates, ease of starting a business, and monetary stability. And Switzerland ranks pretty high on this index, coming in at number 4. The U.S. in comparison comes in at number 12, as it has continued to fall from the top in recent years. Switzerland ranks more economically free than the U.S. because they score higher on rule of law, they're better on taxes, and other things, as I've been learning throughout my journey.
Switzerland has relatively low tax, thanks to intercantonal competition. It has free trade. It has a stable money. What you have to do is give people opportunities, and then they can flourish. Just like this dog can flourish.
She liked that idea.
Well, she likes that.
We can tell.
She's a free market
We
economic.
can tell this dog likes the professor.
And Switzerland certainly has flourished. There was one thing I had to do before wrapping up and heading home. Check out some Swiss cuisine. The Swiss ambassador to the United States, Martin de Hinden, was kind enough to invite me to his residence to enjoy some Swiss cuisine with his private chef, and enjoy I did. The chef prepared a traditional Waldorf salad and sherbet, Waldorf style, of course. The ambassador and I had something in common. We're both foodies. Only he knows a little more about the history of the food. In fact, he's writing a book on Swiss culinary history. Whenever hosting a guest, the ambassador always gives a little backstory with the dishes.
I really discovered that Switzerland has contributed a lot to the culinary history of the world. And so I try to discover interesting persons and doing dinners, lunches around those stories.
Heard the term putting on the Ritz? Well, Ritz was Swiss, but his beginnings were anything but ritzy.
Yes, Caesar Ritz was a Swiss from a very remote area, from a very poor family, and he started and wanted to be a chef in the local tavern. And he started, and the owner of the tavern told you will never achieve in this profession. He was very proud and he wanted to show that it was possible. He went to Paris and to other places in Europe, and eventually he built up those very famous hotels, the Ritz hotels, which were a very important and interesting model. It was a franchising model in the late 19th century when this did not work. So he built up one hotel after the other, and then he committed the most important chefs of his time. One, Auguste Escoffier, the French cook, he did in most of the Ritz restaurants the big menus and of course also dishes we still remember. Ritz understood that it was not only about having a bed and about eating something, but about creating an environment. You mentioned before Oskar Tschirky. He is very similar. He also came from a poor family in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, and his brother was working in New York, and then he emigrated as a poor person, and he has the classical migrant career, starting with nothing, and eventually he got the chance when the Waldorf Astoria, the first Waldorf Astoria hotel in New York started, to be the chef, and he remained afterwards during 50 years the chef of the Waldorf Astoria. You still find, I think, Oscar's bar or Oscar's restaurant in the Waldorf Astoria, and many dishes. The most famous of the dishes is the Waldorf salad he created.
And hence we have the Waldorf salad I enjoyed with the ambassador's chef. Both Caesar Ritz and Oscar the Waldorf were themselves improbable successes. We think of Switzerland as rich and successful, but in the beginning it was a poor country. I asked the ambassador what made Switzerland become so successful, though it was improbable.
I want to answer your question with an anecdote. Have you ever thought why Switzerland has a watch industry? What is typical for a watch, or what was typical for a watch when the first watches were made in the 16th, 17th century? It's something for which you don't need a lot of material, raw material, not a lot of iron, but a lot of skilled labor. And in a country where you have no commodity except water and the brain of the people, you need to come up with a business model where you invest in people, in the skill of the people, in precision. And this is how the watch industry emerged in Switzerland and became a success story. And this is, in a certain way, a model that still exists. Look, for instance, biotechnology. This is one of the cutting-edge areas in the Swiss economy. It's very similar. The second element is Switzerland is a very globalized economy, not inward-looking. This is also linked to the, I would say, modest market. And in those areas where we have a specialization, we need to go to markets beyond our own boundaries. And we have therefore been for centuries, for decades, always a country who wants to have open markets, because our own home market is too small.
Well, my journey had come to an end here in Switzerland. Before heading home, Dr. Ron and I sat by Lake Geneva, taking in the iconic fountain and discussing what I had learned.
Emerald, here you are in this beautiful city, Geneva, the glorious fountain, one of the great cities of the world, historic. And you've been traveling throughout Switzerland over the last week. You have talked to many different people in many different types of environments. What have you learned, do you think, of why Switzerland has succeeded so well with high personal freedom, with great economic development? What is it's unique about Switzerland that has caused this success, do you think?
I think the thing that struck me the most is the bottom-up culture, be it governance, school, work. There's an importance placed on the individual, their responsibility and their voice in decision making. And I think it really moves from the bottom and works its way up the chain, which is nice. And I also noticed that people here feel very stable and secure because it's a highly stable economy and government. And they feel safe opening businesses and having a life here.
I think you've identified two key aspects. Key, people have control over their own lives. They feel like they're masters of their destiny. We saw in these little towns of how they can make decisions and the central government can't come in and dictate to them. And they make decisions about their own lives. And the other thing we saw everybody emphasize was the importance of political and economic stability. This is about the most stable political environment in the world, and it's also had a very stable currency, property rights are protected, and so you feel secure about investing in Switzerland. Also, there's a great deal of honesty here. There's a tradition that very little corruption, and so that if you want to bring your money someplace in the world, here's a good place to do it, and it's logical.
Yeah, it is, and it's just, it was so nice to see how people felt empowered here and feel like they matter and what they say matters.
And it's not just they felt that way, it is indeed true. And I thought it was very interesting when we were in Zermatt and talking to the president of the locale there, and he pointed out that he can't make decisions on his own. When an issue comes up, he has to go back to his people, his constituency, and how they have these direct referendum and they vote on things, and then that is taken up to the canton level and up to the federal level.
I'm just curious though, in seeing how it works in Switzerland, why isn't this the model in more places around the world?
What I think is there's a natural tendency of people like to control other people, and so you've had the long tradition of rulers from the top down. And the Swiss were unique in finding a way to have it come from the bottom up. But clearly we see this growth in places around the world.
But you know what? That goes back to the bottom up.
Yes.
Empowering
exactly.
individuals and working their way up.
Again, it's a citizen army, and it's because people know that people are armed. People from the outside know better than to try to attack it.
Well, I definitely learned a lot from Switzerland. It's been fascinating and interesting, and I think I learned a lot about how important the individual is in governance to take home.
And Switzerland shows, and depending on the particular canton, because they vary in size of government from canton to canton, that small government can work, that people are individually responsible for their own lives. Again, there's a social safety net. Nobody goes hungry in this country. Nobody's without medical care. But that doesn't necessitate a very large central government with an overwhelming bureaucracy. And I was surprised to learn that 22% of the people are foreign born, and even a greater percentage of the workforce was born elsewhere. Yet the people immediately become Swiss. They assimilate perhaps even better than in the United States. And they pick up Swiss values very quickly. And as we see, there's people from countries all over the world, a whole variety of races and ethnic groups, and they understand this basic Swiss model.
So no matter where they're from, they acclimate to the Swiss model extremely well.
Yeah, because they see it works.
So I have a lot of takeaway from Switzerland, but I know there's other things that I need to see.
Now it was back to Zurich to head home. I spent my last night watching the sunset by the lake and enjoying the diverse flavor that is Switzerland. As I watched the sun go down over the Alps, creating a beautiful painting of the sky in Lake Zurich, I thought to myself, Switzerland might just be the happiest place on earth. Well, it does rank number 1 on the Index of Happiness after all, making it no surprise that these happy Swiss people live longer. And maybe they're so happy because they're so free. I thought about something Pierre Bassard, president of the Liberalis Institute in Bern, said.
It's not a genetic thing, if you like, it's not a genetic Swiss thing. The basic factor for the country's success is economic freedom, as it is in everywhere else in the world. And why has economic freedom prevailed in this country, or has prevailed more in this country than in others? It is certainly worth pondering. It has a lot to do with institutions, and these institutions were sustained by culture, by a political culture, and I would say civil culture as well. And this goes back to the 19th century, when enlightened patriots in Switzerland decided to modernize the country and to establish a set of institutions, a new constitution, a classical liberal constitution that was based on these ideas. These ideas also prevailed because they were practical, and people could see that through their implementation, prosperity increased.
I realized that Switzerland is an idea, not a nationality, much like the great American idea. And I realized how an idea can take fire, spreading and forever changing the place and the people it touches. So, here's to you, Switzerland. May you live long and prosper, which you already are. And here's to the hope that other less fortunate places around the globe can, like Switzerland, become an improbable success.